Good morning, please. Can you take your seats so we can start? We have a very heavy agenda, and we wish to not only listen to presentation, but also listen to your views. So please take up your seat, and so we can start. Just a couple of minutes. Before we start, for those who need, we have a French and English interpretation. Please take the device at the entrance. Yeah, okay. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning. You all know about the fourth IPCC report main conclusion that the building sector is the low-hanging fruits when it comes to energy efficiency. Since then, there has been many initiatives all around the world at global, regional, national, local levels. But if we are gathered here today, it's because we are not yet there in terms of low-hanging fruit. We have not done enough, and the problem is still there, recurrent. And we need to face it up if we want effectively to cope with the challenge of 2 degrees or below 2 degrees. We are here gathered today because thanks to the Lima Paris Action Agenda Buildings Initiative, the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, which has successfully mobilized major stakeholders to help deliver the first building day at COP. And I want here to thank the French government for pushing this initiative, and also many partners to whom you will be listening, who will be presenting and advocating for why we are working together on that and what we intend to deliver in the years to come. Major stakeholders forming the Global Alliance for Building and Construction through the LPAA have developed consensus on priority areas, what we call clusters, that must be addressed to achieve a greater scale of action. Public policies and strategies, value chain transformation, finance, and measurement and accountability. The Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction will strengthen and support existing delivery platform and identify areas for greater collaboration, joint delivery, and an increased pace and scale of action, promoting clarity and needed assistance to countries seeking to deliver against climate commitments, the commitments that they will take in these in this couple of weeks, and hopefully we can provide all together the needed support for that. I will not take much of your time. You know, you have seen the documents, why we are here. We have, as I said, a packed agenda. I would like now to call in for starting and for an opening remarks, Mr. Jukka Usukainen, the CTCN director, thanks to whom all this gallery, in fact, gets support, and he is supporting this whole initiative here. We're focusing on innovation. We're looking for solution. This is exactly what we are aiming at. So Jukka, please, if you can come and take the floor.
Thank you very much, and good morning to you all. I'm really would like to welcome you all on behalf of the United Nations Environment Programme to this very important day where we learn so much. I'm also happy to to support this event on behalf of the Climate Technology Center and Network, which is a body under the UNFCCC framework. And of course, I'm happy to finally be able to visit Green Zone from that blue one, where negotiations seems to be very difficult. Here, everything seems to be going on, and people are realizing the climate actions. I'm also happy that building sector has been going on for so many years, deepening its understanding of climate issues and energy issues, sustainable development, because while I was an officer in my government, Finland, actually we started negotiation these particular issues already in Johannesburg Sustainable Conference 2002. And now I'm seeing the fruit of this work, which is great to observe. Now, building and residence is a most critical area of climate, both for mitigation and adaptation. It seems to be just that it's not so easily visible among a kind of conventional ways of describing and defining climate technologies. So when we are looking at the kind of traditional sectors, building sector crosses over and overarching actually energy supply, it overarches energy use, and also industry, which is very important a kind of sector. And still it contributes 1/3 of all global climate emissions. So in that sense, we need to pay attention to this sector when we are discussing climate technologies. But building sector is also a kind of wicked challenge or problem, because whenever you are building, it involves very high costs. And that means then that making changes, making those changing for sustainability, for climate, always comes into a difficult discussion of how much you pay upfront costs, when you know that somewhere there at the end of the life cycle, somebody else is going to pay dearly. Because whatever we are building today is affecting many generations to become. And of course, we should be aware of this and not bring our burden into the next generations by making wrong choices in building and residence. The CTCN is a body under UNFCCC. It was established in Cancun in Mexico already over 5 years ago. We are in the use of the developing country parties of the conventions. We are serving them on any of their technology needs and in climate. Already over 40 countries, actually we are very young center. We only started operations last year, 2014. But already over 40 countries, developing countries, have come to us for technological and technical assistance on 70 different requests, both covering mitigation technologies and adaptation technologies. And we are also blessed with having more than 100 specialized institutions and organizations which have joined our so-called CTCN network. So we are ready to operate and we are ready to use. I may emphasize that we are totally bottom-up organizations. We are the country-driven in that sense that it's the country's national designated entities who will submit the request from the country to us. To this day, unfortunately maybe to you, is that there has been no request on particularly kind of dealing with the building sector. The nearest kind of request which we have got from the countries have been dealing with, for example, municipal waste management or municipal district heating systems. We would be extremely happy if countries, developing countries, would submit requests which will deal with the exactly building and residence. It can be on strategic level, it can be on the planning level, even on the legislation level, or it can be much more concrete feasibility study, cost-benefit analysis. We are ready to submit and render any expertise to those countries who wish to have that kind of service from us. And this is a free of charge service without any conditions. So this is my invitation to this audience, that could you please be active with those developing country authorities who feel that they would need some extra assistance to this, and CTCN is on their service. So I end here and for this plea, and hope the very successful day for us all. Thank you.
Jukka, thank you very much, and thank you for offering your availability and providing this expertise to others. I'm sure by the end of the day and the end of these 2 weeks, you'll have many people coming to you, because many people are here looking for assistance and support. We have now the pleasure and honor to have among us the Minister Glenn Murray, Minister of Environment and Climate Change for Province of Ontario in Canada. He was first elected on the Ontario legislature in 2010 as the MPP for Toronto Centre. He was re-elected in 2011 and 2014. Mr. Murray currently serves as Minister of Environment and Climate Change. He was appointed the Minister of Infrastructure and the Minister of Transportation in February 2013. This to say that he covers and he has an overall understanding of the importance of the building in this context. He has had a lifetime of activism in urban planning, sustainable development, and community health. Mr. Murray, can you please deliver the keynote speech?
Thank you very much, Arab, and thank you all for your hospitality. I've been looking forward to joining you now for quite a while, because in the case of Ontario, like many jurisdictions, we're struggling with the next generation of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. As you know, many of us are looking at the politics and the process by which you can actually get deep reductions. And I think most jurisdictions, national or sub, or what we now call infranational governance, we are not a subordinated government with the Canadian Federation. We're separately sovereign. So in areas like the regulation of buildings, the final authority rests with the provinces in Canada. So the level of cooperation between governments necessary to reduce emissions has to be very engaged and highly cooperative. But we, over the last decade, closed all of our coal plants. And I think that's certainly in the North American context, that's usually when you're starting down a climate strategy. If you have any significant amount of coal production of energy, coal-fired production of energy, most of your largest emission reductions come from that, and you see that happening now. Ontario just completed the closure of all of our coal plants. A challenging thing, because we didn't have a cap and trade or a pricing system, so it was all cost in. We didn't have any credits to trade, and I think if we were doing it all over again, we probably would have started with cap and trade first and done coal plant closures second. But we're working with Michigan, as you know, a large automotive state, as Ontario is the largest automobile producing jurisdiction in North America. Michigan is now going down the road of closing 9 coal plants, and as you know, Alberta, which is quite oil intensive in Canada, is now closing its coal plants. So having been the first into this, we're spending a lot of time providing technical support to other jurisdictions. But once you get past coal closures, you get into a much more complex series of areas in which you have to reduce emissions. And as you know, we're working with Quebec right now and with California to develop and link a carbon market with them in a cap and trade system. And all of that set the table for the 2 largest areas of emissions for jurisdictions like Ontario around the world. Once you get energy under control, and our energy emissions are way down, way below 1990 levels. Our industry emissions, through a series of initiatives, are really way below 1990 levels. So those 2 large areas of emissions, industry and energy, are significantly on track. All of the 2 largest areas of emissions now are buildings and transportation. About 20% of our emissions from buildings and about 35% from transportation. So our next 5-year action plan is focused very heavily on buildings and transportation, and we join a group of jurisdictions, national, international, subnational jurisdictions, that are all facing that challenge. And you can almost divide all of the world up in the industrialized and post-industrialized world into jurisdictions that are basically what I would call pre-coal, which are really dealing predominantly with energy issues and energy generation issues, or post-coal and post-fossil fuels, who are pretty much, in the case of Ontario, half nuclear, half renewables, dealing with buildings and with vehicles. And those deal with consumer and personal choices and complex issues around building code and around building retrofits. So, given that to meet our targets were 6% below 1990 levels last year, which we met, and 15% by 2020, 37% by 2040, and 80% to carbon neutral by 2050. So that's a fairly aggressive agenda. It is interesting because we are just now rolling out how we cycle money from cap and trade back into our economy. So our cap and trade system is expected to generate within a few years up to about $2 billion a year, which sounds like a lot of money, but when you actually start to apply it to things like building retrofit programs, it becomes quite complex. So you have to rapidly deploy to every building you've ever built a retrofit program that brings those buildings down to net zero or darn close to net zero, because you don't want to have to go in repeatedly to have to go back again to retrofit again, retrofit again, retrofit again. The other piece is to stop the bleeding. You have to start building buildings that are net zero now. In my constituency, which is a postage stamp piece of downtown Toronto with a central business district, 2 large universities, 3 basically neighborhoods that are very low income that are the major recipients of refugees in Canada, and 2 of the most affluent neighborhoods all fit into something that's not much bigger than the site we're on. We have 81 office and residential towers under construction right now. There's more buildings going up in Toronto than either in New York or in Chicago. We've been in a sustained boom for about a decade now in building construction, both in single-family homes, but particularly in mixed buildings. None of those buildings right now are being built anywhere near net zero. And so part of our challenge in the near term is to get an economically positive proposition for developers and builders to shift those buildings over. The other challenge is financing, because if you're building condo towers, which are very popular right now given the demographics of our population in Canada, a lot of newcomers, about 2/3, 3/4 of my constituents in Toronto were not born in Canada. I represent, the neighborhoods I represent speak 190 different languages. We're now the recipients of thousands of new Syrians who are joining the Canadian family. So the complexity of housing and the complexity of an urban environment like that is challenging, because you're building housing for entry-level affordable public housing right up to complex high-end market housing. But they share a common problem. Most developers and builders are building to competitive price, and they're not paying the operating costs of those condominiums or their offices. They're not hugely incentive to spend another $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 when building a unit to make it a low energy net zero building. So the fact that the financing of the capital asset of the building is done by the developers, but the operating costs of those heating and cooling systems is paid for by the condo owner after, what you get, as in my case, I have a very expensive condominium that was reasonably affordable to buy and have had to replace the HVAC systems that are very intensive 3 times in my unit. So we have a problem in Canada of buildings that are built with systems that are not energy efficient nor low carbon. So one of our biggest challenges in building low carbon buildings, especially for offices and for condominiums and apartments, is actually having absorbing the higher cost of green and low carbon technologies, better insulation, better R factors in the front end, and then financing it against that. Because the life cycle cost of a building, if my condo unit costs $40,000 or $50,000 more, costs about $600,000, it would be a very energy efficient unit. And the operating costs, to me, would be much less over the life cycle. But we don't amortize the costs of a condo purchase against the life cycle costs. The whole unit is costing me more and costing the builder less. So one of the big things we're working on is trying to create a new set of financial products for green leases for offices, and to absorb that the net cost of that unit over its life cycle is lower. How do you create an input cost where you get that savings up front? And we've done that before in Canada, and I think we're probably not alone, is when we did HVACs and geothermal, ground source, heat pumps, and those kinds of things. You would get a grant and a loan through your utility bill, and against your lower operating costs, you would finance and amortize the financing of that. And that's probably, interestingly, one of the biggest challenges that we're now facing is working with our finance ministry and our banking sector and credit unions and mortgage companies and builders to create a new set of financial tools that absorb the life cycle costs. What's happening right now is interesting. In single-family homes on green and net zero buildings, we're not having that problem. You can go through most of Ontario right now, and there's a great company called Royal Park Homes that will sell you a home with a geothermal pump, an inverter, solar panels on the roof, and you're completely off-grid. And these guys drive large Cadillac Escalades and wear Armani suits. They're not exactly your Birkenstock-wearing, tofu-eating, Joe Baez concert-going environmentalists. What the value proposition for them is, it's a lot easier to sell a house that doesn't come with a heating or energy bill, and is what we often call moving those people from being consumers of energy to being prosumers, where they're producing often more energy in their home through these different ground source, heating, solar, and hybrid technologies in a highly well-insulated house. In Canada, where the city I was mayor of the city of Winnipeg, where the temperatures go from 40 below Celsius in the winter to 40 degrees Celsius above. And we started those kinds of ground source heat pumps and geothermal systems to get to a base temperature in the home of about 17 degrees, because almost all of this housing were projects done with Jimmy Carter through Habitat for Humanity. And the biggest challenge, and if you know how the Habitat for Humanity program works, people put sweat equity time into building their homes, and then they have to operate it. And the geothermal wasn't just attractive because it was a net zero technology, it dramatically lowered the heating and cooling costs. And so if you think that in most of the world you have to retrofit all of those buildings, and in northern climates that's a huge, huge challenge, it improves the productivity of the building. You're dramatically using the amount of energy being used. You switch out natural gas, which is our major source of emissions in our buildings, and you're replacing it with non-fossil fuels. You're also creating a building that is more productive. It is using space more efficiently. It is using energy more efficiently. It is using sunlight more efficiently. It is using water more efficiently. It is a much more highly productive building. And it connects to the basic philosophy of our approach to climate change and GHG reductions, which is to improve the productivity of our economy, the productivity of buildings, lands, and transportation systems. And so we're always looking for improving the amount of energy we get out, the amount we can get out of every kilowatt out of energy, the amount that we get out of the efficiency of every building. So a much higher performance building is really quite extraordinary. I was recently in Manhattan, and if any of you know the Durst organization, they have this interesting process. They bought their first building in New York, in Manhattan, in 1928, and they've never sold a single building, because they look at recovering the profitability of the building over 40, 50, or 60 years. They're now one of the largest landlords in Manhattan in New York, and they have the highest performance buildings, because they have so unrelentlessly improved the insulation, gone to net zero. They've just recently built the Bank of America Tower in Bryant Park. These are all state-of-the-art buildings. Back in my mayoral days in Winnipeg, we built 3 buildings that are interesting for you to look at, and this is part of the challenge of how to deploy them. One was the Mountain Equipment Co-op store in downtown Winnipeg, which was built completely out of the waste on the site and is close to a net zero building, built from what were very pretty crappy, low-grade, low-value buildings on the site. The Manitoba Hydro Tower, which was a partnership between the province, the utility, and the city, is pretty close to a net zero building with a huge solar chimney, and it is about 32 stories of office space, a large complex office in, as I said, a city that has an 80 degrees Celsius range in temperature over 12 months, works on geothermal, adjusted wind and air circulation and geothermal. There's not a single drop of fossil fuel used in it. It's often rated as one of the greenest buildings in the world. And the other one was a college called Red River College, which was the restoration of heritage buildings using everything from photovoltaics to geothermal. What we discovered when we did those more complex institutional buildings were that the costs of the technology initially were very high, and partly because no one was building these buildings on any large scale. But what we found is the operating costs of the public sector once they were built were a small fraction, 20, 30, 40% of what a conventional building would do. And you get into that, how do you, because people in municipalities, if any of you have been in city government, will often buy the cheap compressed sodium lighting because it's so darn inexpensive to put up, because the LED lighting, which is now less expensive, back in the day was so expensive. Your capital budget, you could buy 10 times as much lighting if you bought the energy intensive stuff, and who really cared, because you passed the operating costs on to future city councils, and that was deferral of cost. And so there's always this competition right now, I think, in buildings when you're doing policy between the greener technologies that are actually better. They cost you less over time to operate, but come with initial capital costs. So what we're trying to do is find ways to deploy rapidly new technologies. So we're not interested, so when we're looking at geothermal heat pumps, we will have to work with our industry to pick the right mix, which I think probably for us will be a mixture of geothermal, heat pumps, and inverters. And we have to deploy them not in hundreds or thousands of homes, but in hundreds of thousands and millions of homes. The other thing that happens, and this is a struggle in much of the Western world right now, is a high level of unemployment and youth unemployment. And the last piece I want to talk about is not just developing the right financing tools, but you need a whole new set of skills to build green buildings and to retrofit green buildings. So the skill and employment training is extraordinarily complex. And as you discover, there's no such thing as a green building unless you've got people who are skilled at managing a green building and know that. And if you go and visit any of these large projects, like the Bank of America, the people at the Durst Organization, or the people who started the Manitoba Hydro in Winnipeg, which are probably two of the most large and complex buildings that operate at net zero, spent more time trying to develop the training programs for maintenance and building management to effectively manage it. And also to manage the tenants, because what happened when the Bank of America moved into the Durst building, it went from being one of the greenest buildings in Manhattan to being one of the brownest, because their computer systems completely ate up all the energy capacity and the heating cooling requirements, completely inversed the building. And the biggest challenge was to get the tenant to re-engineer their computer systems, their cloud management, and their IT systems to align with the building. And the final piece, if you can get the training and maintenance and you can get all the skilled trades, building and management together, you then have to deal with the regulation of these buildings. So in Toronto right now, there is a major net zero condo going up called Mimico on the Go. Our rapid regional express system is called Go Transit. And it's interesting. The builder I've gotten to know quite well. The first challenge he faced was when he went to get approvals, the city of Toronto said, well, you know, you have these charges for natural gas hookups and these pipes and these building setbacks and these requirements, and we're going to charge you all of these things. So $5 million in fees and charges from the city for things this building did not have. This building is a completely geothermal, off-grid, net zero, high-rise condo, one of 3 going up, that doesn't emit a single gram of carbon or kilogram of carbon. Zero. It doesn't emit anything. But the building is going to, one of the biggest costs of the building and disincentive for building green buildings in many jurisdictions that are like Ontario, going down this quite aggressively for the first time, is that they simply have no recognition in the building standards. They were told it would take four years to get the approval, where if they use natural gas, the approvals would be done in 4 months. So you've got to remove the friction from the approval process. And what we're doing right now is designing an entirely new building code and an entirely new approval systems with our municipalities to remove requirements, not adapt requirements, but to massively remove requirements, fees, and charges, because all of a sudden these buildings become very, 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 very equivalent. And part of the challenge is also when they're redistributive, not only do you have to remove the costs, but if they're not using central generation, it creates big challenges for your nuclear, hydro, central generation, and your grid, because all of these people in redistributive energy are no longer the customers of the central utility. So you not only have the cost side, you're also losing revenue, because if people are using the grid, they're often using the grid to sell the energy generated by these systems in these buildings back to the grid. Creates a huge range of public policy challenges and pricing challenges and financing and regulation challenges, and I will leave you without sufficient solutions, but hopefully enough provocative questions and complicated problems that smarter people than me will come up and solve during the rest of the day for you. So thank you very much, and God bless.
Mr. Murray, thank you for this very inspiring and encouraging speech. Closing coal plants is very challenging, not easy, an issue that is all around here being discussed. Many people, many countries will have to listen to you to learn what you have been doing, how you managed it, an ambitious program on construction, really looking at the technologies, finance through a life cycle approach. We definitely need you and Ontario in this alliance. We need you as an active member, so please sign in and join us. And allow me to say something that probably I should not say, but probably you need to educate many more politicians to say exactly what you have said, to have the understanding of the process as you did it. I think it's not very common to listen to politicians saying the same things, looking at action-oriented, being so action-oriented. So thank you very much, inspiring, and please join us in the initiative and help us in moving it further. We now move to the panels and the sessions, and I will be calling here Mrs. Sandrine Dixon de Clèves from the Prince of Wales Corporate Leaders Group. Since 2009, Sandrine has run the EU office of the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership and the Prince of Wales Corporate Leadership Group on Climate Change, and is a distinguished faculty member of CLI Executive Education Program. Sandrine was recognized by GreenBiz as one of the 30 most influential women across the globe driving change in the low-carbon economy and promoting green business. So another person to whom we need to listen more carefully and try to see how she can also lead by example. Sandrine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'm so pleased to be here in front of you, and I hope that we will have a very exciting panel. Our patron, His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, had the honor of actually opening COP21. And although he didn't directly mention the link between buildings and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, many of you know that he has always been very much involved in ensuring that actually buildings are not only built in a way in which they continue to have aesthetics and class, but also for the last 30 years, he has been a staunch supporter of sustainability and climate change, and has very much wanted to make the links between buildings and that very important goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So the Prince of Wales Corporate Leaders Group members have been working with this aspiration for many years. And it's a real pleasure to be joined here by many other business organizations, including the Green Business Council, WBCSD, Architecture 2030, that is bringing actually designers and architects, UNEP, who has been working with us to try to build this alliance of different organizations to work hand in hand with government to have a direct impact on the buildings that will be built in the future, but also renovations of existing buildings. It is only together that we will start to actually have a complete change in our built environment. This needs the entire value chain. If we are really going to start to take account of the 40% of global energy use and the impact of a third of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, we have to act together now. And that is the beauty of this alliance. I would like to thank, on behalf of all the different organizations that have worked with both UNEP and the French government to put together this alliance, for the initiative. Because I think as we've gone through this process, we've realized just how difficult it will be to move forward, and we can only do so together. So I would like to call upon the stage the distinguished panel for this conversation, which is entitled Goals and Solutions, the Building Sector, Reducing Our Impact and Moving Towards 2 degrees. So Ed, can I ask you to come up? Can I ask the rest of the panel? I know there are a few people who had difficulty getting here this morning, so we might have to play around a little bit with the way in which the panel, if you can just, do you want to come up here first? Okay. Yeah. So slowly we will let everyone come up. The way in which we would like to run this is that Ed will open up with a presentation, and then we will have the panel reflect on this presentation, and then hopefully have an exchange with you as well. So Ed, it's a real pleasure to have you up here, coming over from the United States, but all your distinguished work also across Asia and the rest of the world. I hope you're going to talk a little bit about the Asia Accord as well, which is very exciting. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sandrine, and it's a pleasure to be here. The title of this talk is The Road to Zero, and how do we stay under the 2 degrees C threshold, and what's the path to get there, and what's the timeline? The timeline is really important, and we hope that that will come out in whatever comes out of the COP21 in another week. So, the road to zero. In order to stay under the 2 degrees C warming threshold, we must phase out CO2 emissions in the built environment, especially the urban built environment, by the year 2050. 2050 is a key date, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We know where most of the emissions are coming from. 75% of all human-produced global greenhouse gas emissions comes from the urban built environment, especially from our cities worldwide. We also know that during the next 2 decades, we will build an unprecedented amount of building stock. We'll build 80 billion square meters of new buildings and then tear down and rebuild new buildings only in urban areas worldwide. To give you an idea of what that is, that's equal to 60% of the entire building stock of the world over the next 2 decades. Or another way to look at it, it's like building the equivalent of a New York City every 35 days globally. This is either a huge opportunity where we solve the problem, or if we don't get it right, we don't get this building right, in the next 2 decades, we will lock in energy consumption and emissions patterns for the next 80 to 120 years. And that's the critical role that the built environment and the building sector plays. So where's all this building going to take place? Well, we have a good idea of where it's going to take place. India will be responsible for about 9% of all this building. Other emerging nations, mostly Southeast Asia, about 12%. But between the US and Canada and China, we will be responsible for 53% roughly of all global construction over the next 2 decades. These are the 2 largest emitting countries. So we have a huge, unique opportunity to get this right and to demonstrate how we move forward in this sector. Why 2050? Well, the IPCC ran 4 different scenarios. The only scenario that gets us under the 2 degrees C, that gives us a 66% chance of getting under the 2 degrees C, is phasing out CO2 emissions in the built environment, in the energy sector and the industrial sector by about 2070. But a 66% chance gives us a 33% chance of going over 2 degrees C, and those are not very good odds. So the fourth scenario was run again with a phase out of CO2 emissions by the year 2050, and that gives us a high probability of staying under the 2 degrees centigrade. It's called the 1.5 degree C scenario. The reason that is critical, that this 2050 date is critical and should be in any final declaration that comes out of this conference, out of the COP21, is because the other 3 scenarios, once you pass the 2 degrees C, there's so much inertia in the atmosphere that the planet keeps on warming, and it essentially, climate change and global warming becomes irreversible. It's only by staying under 2 degrees C that we can actually bring the climate back to pre-industrial levels or close to today's levels. We discovered the building sector in 2003, that it was the largest energy consuming and emitting sector in our country, in the US, and in the world. And in 2006, we issued the 2030 targets that for all new buildings and major renovations where you actually gut the buildings, we need to get to carbon neutral by the year 2030. Those targets and that challenge was immediately adopted by the American Institute of Architects, the OAA, the RAIC, architecture communities all over adopted it. U.S. Conference of Mayors adopted it. 70% today, 70% of the top architecture engineering firms in the U.S. and really around the world have adopted those targets and are beginning to work diligently to meet those standards. We know that 54% of all U.S. firms have adopted the targets, and 63% of U.S. AE firms feel that they can get to carbon neutral in their designs and building designs and construction by the year 2030. The U.S. federal government is phasing out fossil fuels in all new buildings and major renovations, government-owned buildings and renovations by the year 2030. They're at a 65% reduction today. That's by law. The state of California initiated their big, bold strategies. We worked with them on this for quite some time. Zero net energy for residential buildings, new residential buildings by 2020, and Z&E for commercial buildings by the year 2030, adopting the targets. And there are many states and counties and cities that have adopted the targets in the U.S. and around the world. We also issued a products challenge. As we reduce building operations emissions, products then, the embodied carbon in building products, becomes huge. It becomes the largest contributor. And so we call for a 50% embodied carbon reduction by the year 2030 in all building products, and we're now getting manufacturers now stepping up to the plate. So in the US, what have we done? This was the projection in 2005. We were at about 40 quads of energy. That's how much the whole building sector uses. You just have to know it's roughly 40. And we were projected to go up roughly at a 45-degree angle, a 43% increase by the year 2030. That's what was projected in the US in 2005. Every year that projection has come down, so that today, in 2014, by the end of 2014, our building sector is actually down in terms of energy consumption, and business as usual is flat. That's nothing more than what we're doing now. And we've added 30 billion square feet to our building stock since 2005, and our energy consumption and emissions are down. The projections are, if we just use the technology we have today, we can reduce it even more, and that doesn't even include design strategies, which is what the building sector and the design sector is ramping up to do. So our projections are going to zero by 2050. Not only that, we've heard about all the additional costs. It costs this much, it costs that much. We've already saved the American consumer $560 billion from 2005 to now, than what they were projected to spend on energy costs. That's how much they're not spending right now. That's more than the entire bailout for the US economy to get us out of the recession. And the numbers are staggering. We sent a 2050 imperative declaration to Durban. The world's architecture community met in Durban this year, and they passed the 2050 imperative, calling for all global architecture firms and architects all over the world. This was adopted by every major architecture professional organization to get to zero, the built environment to zero emissions by 2030. And we're just back from China, and we have our colleagues from China, Mr. Chen Zhen, and other colleagues here with us today. We issued the China Accord, and we signed the China Accord a few weeks ago in China. 52 of the largest international, multinational architecture, engineering, and planning firms, along with the local design institutes, the largest local design institutes in China, have signed on to the Accord. The Accord calls for pledging to design all cities, urban developments, new buildings, and major renovations in China to low carbon or carbon neutral standards. And we're now just beginning to talk about the programs that we need to put in place to make this happen in China. We've issued the roadmap to zero. How do we get to zero in the built environment by 2050? And the road to zero consists of 2 action items. Action item 1 is for new buildings and major renovations. That's for the 80 billion square meters that we're going to build worldwide. And action item 2 is for the 135 billion square meters of current global building stock. We have to address those 2 items in order to get the building sector down to zero. So action item 1, new buildings and major renovations. We're calling for all new building designs to meet a 70% fossil fuel reduction target. That doesn't mean that the building uses 70% less energy. It could make up that energy by importing or on-site renewables, so that the actual CO2 emissions are down about 70%, and then getting all the way to carbon neutral by the year 2030 in increments. These are the 2030 targets that have been now adopted globally by our professions. How do we get to carbon neutral? It's a 2-step process. Step 1 gets us almost 70 to 80%, 60% to 80% of the way there. That's no cost, low cost, cost savings options. That's just design. The form of the building, how we orient it, where we put the glass, whether we use passive design strategies, equipment, all those things that don't cost anything, that's just information, can get us a huge reduction. And then step 2 is obviously adding the renewables, either on-site renewables or purchasing renewables through the grid. The second step is that we need to renovate our existing building stock. Developed countries need to renovate 2 to 3% of their building stock every year to about a 50% reduction, and developing countries about 1.5 to 2%. If we do this, this is what happens. And I'll finish on this. This is the roadmap. This is where we are now today. That's how much CO2 emitting fossil fuels in the building sector, and that's how much non-CO2. We've actually been going up. If we implement those 2 strategies, this is what happens. We reduce the energy consumption of the building sector by 1.25% a year. That's a 42% reduction. We have existing about another 26% that exists of non-CO2 emitting energy. That makes up the other part, and then we have to roughly double that, a little more than double that, to get the entire building sector to zero. So if we do that, we stay under the 2 degrees C. I want to thank you, and we have an event coming up on December 9th, Wednesday, in Paris, that is how to do all this. So it'll be a 3-hour event with the best technologies, demonstrations of how to get to zero in Paris. So it's on there. We'll have some flyers given out if you need them. Register and come to the event and see how we're going to actually do all this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ed. I think you've really set the stage for what I hope will be a very interactive panel. And the challenge is, how do we actually meet net zero by 2050? And Ed, Architecture 2030 has been working hard on this in bringing designers and architects together. But what we have here in front of us in terms of this panel is how do we actually also bring governments? How can we actually ensure that other players, the finance sector, are deeply involved in order to assist in the transition? What we're doing at the European level is trying to get businesses through the entire value chain to hit nearly net energy, zero energy, buildings by 2020. And it's a huge feat. We actually even have the regulation and we're not there yet. So the challenge is, everyone knows that this is the right way to move forward. How do we actually get there? So could we open up the floor with some reflections on what are some of the possible solutions? And Ms. Broadwater, you're coming to us from the International Finance Corporation, a very important player across the globe in terms of channeling finance into some of these very important energy efficiency solutions, not only just in the buildings value chain, but also in other sectors as well. But if you could just focus on the buildings value chain. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I'm Marcine Broadwater, and I'm head of strategy and business development for the IFC, and we're the private sector arm of the World Bank. So my perspective is really going to be focusing on emerging economies because that's where we work. And you heard today about the huge challenge, how much we're building in the next few decades. And for example, in our areas in China, for example, in the next decade, China is going to build as much as all of Latin America has today. In the next 15 years, India is going to double its residential sector. And Brazil, over the next 15 years, will be growing at 20% a year, its construction industry. So the challenge is tremendous. And in the emerging markets is the fastest growing areas, in the world in terms of putting in new buildings. So the World Bank and IFC, we are committed to seeing this growth being put onto a green path. And we see this as an opportunity not to be locked in to 60 to 80 years of high consumption of resources. But the question is, why are we having difficulty doing this? How do we get on the road? What is happening? And in looking for solutions, we have noted that it's not, technology and know-how do not seem to be the problem. We all know the economic benefits of building green, but these benefits are not being captured. The IEA has told us that the building environment is capturing the least amount of economic value in terms of energy efficiency. Only 20% of economic efficiency is being captured in buildings today. So the building is complex. The building industry is complex. And there are a lot of interests that diverge between owners and builders, bankers and users. And this asymmetry of information and value creation is causing a problem. We have what we call the cycle of blame, where everyone is trying to say, well, who should actually pay the additional costs for building green? And we have misperceptions. The World Green Building Council did a survey that said that people believe that building green costs up to 30% more than a conventional building. While our experience, for example, in pilot projects in South Africa shows that it could be as little as 3%. There's a lot of no cost or low cost or taking out costs in building green if you're doing it well. So, and there's some financial benefits that we need to document, such as lower utility bills, faster sales, better resale value, and lower default rates. So how do we capture that? How do we get that information out there? I would say that there are 4 clear steps that we need to take. One, we need a clear definition of a green building standard. And I would say that needs to focus on energy, water, and materials, and energy embedded in materials, and savings for the end users that can be verified, and that leads to demonstrable reduction in utility costs. And this is an important driver, especially in the developing world, where utility costs can range up to 20% of disposable income for a moderate family, for example. So it's huge. I'm almost done. The second is easy-to-use technology that allows building designers to choose the lowest cost options to help them reach a green building standard. And combine that with a fast, inexpensive certification system to verify that the buildings are meeting that standard. Third, an enabling environment from the government, which raises the bar through increasingly greener building codes and provides the right incentives. And finally, this collection of evidence that building green has positive financial returns to all parties in the building ecosystem. And this is especially important to bankers and to the financing, because these are the folks who can finance this pipeline of green buildings at acceptable rates by monetizing the economic benefits of building green. So I think with those four pieces, this is how we're going to show that there is something, everyone wins financially by building green, and we have a chance at collective action. And hopefully later I'll be able to talk to you about some of the things that the IFC is doing in order to implement these four strategies. Thank you.
Thank you for First of all, you were bang on time, so well done. And secondly, really appreciate the fact that you've given us these four strategies, because I think we can build on them as we go through the panel. And I'm often fascinated by the fact that when we talk about finance, we forget to think about all the co-benefits as well. We don't actually calculate the wellness benefits or the health benefits as much as we should in a building, or even as some constructors would say, the employment benefits, because you're actually going to have more employees working in a healthy building than you would if you had a very unhealthy building. So loss of employment or sick days, etc., is also the flip side of this. And I think building that narrative is fundamental as well, that we're not just talking about the technology and the changes within a building, we're actually talking about a much healthier environment for people and urban society. You gave one of the challenges, which was an enabling environment from the government. So I'd like to point to ADEME, if I may, and ask actually Dominique Campanat to just say a few words about what ADEME is doing to try to create that enabling environment, and whether or not you agree that we also should move to clearer standards in terms of what green buildings are.
Thank you very much. If you don't mind, I will speak French, because we have the advantage of a translation. And donc je représente l'ADEME, et je ne parlerai pas de ce que l'ADEME ferait en France, puisque vous savez, la France a un objectif très ambitieux de réduire les consommations de 50% d'ici 2050. Et évidemment, le secteur du bâtiment, qui représente 44% de la consommation, est un secteur prioritaire, à la fois pour les bâtiments existants et aussi, bien entendu, pour les bâtiments neufs. Et donc l'ADEME a en charge d'accompagner cette politique, et nous intervenons sur toutes les déclinaisons, aussi bien la réglementation que la formation, que la sensibilisation des utilisateurs, bien évidemment aussi l'accompagnement avec des standards, et puis l'innovation. Mais cet après-midi, nous aurons l'occasion sans doute de présenter plus en détail ce que fait la France et l'ADEME. Je voudrais surtout attirer l'attention sur la situation des bâtiments en zone tropicale. Parce que vous savez qu'aujourd'hui, vous avez 40% de la population mondiale qui vit dans la ceinture intertropicale. En 2060, ça sera 60%. Ça fait à peu près 3,3 milliards d'habitants aujourd'hui, qui vont avoir des besoins croissants, donc qui vont voir leur consommation augmenter, notamment dans le bâtiment, et qui sont soumis à des conditions climatiques extrêmement difficiles. Et donc le confort thermique est au moins aussi important que tout ce qui est réduction des consommations. Donc vous le voyez sur cette slide, vous voyez que dans les pays du Nord, dans les années qui vont venir, les consommations dans les bâtiments vont rester à peu près constantes. Par contre, si vous regardez ce qui se passe dans les pays comme l'Afrique, l'Asie du Sud-Est ou l'Amérique du Sud, vous voyez que ces consommations dans le bâtiment vont augmenter énormément. Donc aujourd'hui, il se trouve que tout ce qui se fait en termes de recherche, de financement pour les bâtiments, par exemple passifs ou bioclimatiques en milieu tropical, représente très peu d'implications, et on se rend compte qu'il va falloir faire un effort pour cette zone-là. Donc ce que je voulais vous dire très rapidement, c'est que, deuxième slide, j'en ai 3 en tout. 3.
Ah, 3.
Deuxième slide. L'ADEME, comme je vous le disais, accompagne ce qui se fait en France, donc en France et en particulier en Outre-mer. Ce n'est pas inscrit ici, mais en Outre-mer, il y a déjà une réglementation thermique dans la construction neuve qui est apparue et qui fait en sorte de diffuser des pratiques vertueuses pour ce qui est l'architecture bioclimatique et l'architecture passive. Alors, par exemple, à l'île de la Réunion, il y a une première mondiale qui est un amphithéâtre qui fonctionne complètement en ventilation naturelle, à l'image d'un théâtre de plein air, et qui est 5 fois moins consommateur en énergie qu'un bâtiment identique qui ne serait pas un bâtiment passif. Donc, à côté de ce qu'on fait en Outre-mer depuis longtemps, l'ADEME est associée à des projets qui ont été lancés à la fois en Afrique et à la fois dans les pays d'Asie. Alors, l'Asie et l'Afrique sont des pays extrêmement importants en termes d'augmentation des populations, puisqu'elles représenteront 56 à 64% de la population mondiale à l'horizon 2050. Donc, très rapidement, je voulais juste signaler une initiative en Asie, océan Indien, d'une plateforme d'expertise régionale sur le bâtiment tropical qui a été lancée. Donc vous voyez ce qui se passe, c'est des comparaisons de projets, des bases de données, différents benchmarks et différents types de démonstrations. Deuxième initiative que je voulais souligner, c'est en Afrique de l'Ouest, 15 pays d'Afrique de l'Ouest qui ont adopté une directive sur l'efficacité énergétique qui a été lancée l'année dernière, également avec des standards, avec des seuils minimums de consommation d'énergie exigés et l'utilisation de matériaux locaux, ce qui est aussi extrêmement important, et d'autres projets qui sont faits dans le cadre de la francophonie. Et ceci me conduit à terminer ma présentation en vous indiquant que dans le cadre de l'Alliance globale pour les bâtiments et la construction, nous avons lancé un flagship qui s'appelle « Construction durable en zone tropicale », donc qui est mis en œuvre par l'ADEME. Donc vous trouverez à la sortie les différents flyers. On a déjà un certain nombre de participants. Et donc ce flagship a développé un plan d'action pour 2016-2020. Donc vous verrez plus en détail un plan d'action avec diffusion de méthodologie, renforcement de compétences et notamment aussi facilitation de l'accès au financement. Et deuxième point du flagship, des engagements pour les 5 prochaines années. Donc des engagements en termes de pays impliqués. On espère qu'on aura 20 pays pilotes d'ici 2020. Des engagements en termes de méthodologie, également méthodologie se rapportant à la conception bioclimatique et au confort thermique. Et puis des engagements en matière de réglementation thermique, avec, on souhaite, 20 pays qui s'impliquent. Et enfin, la possibilité d'avoir des opérations exemplaires. On espère qu'on pourra atteindre 100 bâtiments exemplaires reproductibles d'ici 2020. Donc je vous invite à rejoindre ce flagship et vous pouvez nous contacter à la fin de la session.
Merci beaucoup. Donc je tiens à remercier en fait le gouvernement français pour non seulement leur leadership au niveau de cette nouvelle initiative, mais aussi le fait qu'ensemble, nous avons travaillé pour essayer de commencer à formaliser une alliance entre les différents gouvernements et aussi les différents business. Je trouve que ce que vous nous dites est aussi très important parce que ça démontre un leadership au niveau de différents pays qui peuvent travailler avec d'autres pays qui sont outre-mer ou qui sont dans des pays en voie de développement. Et ça, c'est absolument fondamental. Donc, le leadership d'un gouvernement ne doit pas se restreindre au niveau domestique, mais doit aussi essayer de travailler avec d'autres gouvernements et d'autres personnes qui sont dans la chaîne de valeur dans justement ce domaine-ci. Donc, un grand merci. Moving on to the next speaker, we'll switch back to English. Matt Golden, you represent civil society here and are a senior consultant in Investor Confidence Project. What, from your perspective, is important in terms of ensuring that we decarbonize the built environment and move towards net zero? And what can civil society do to work with governments and also business in order to ensure that we move forward faster and in a more cohesive way?
Thank you. The Investor Confidence Project is a project of the Environmental Defense Fund, which is an international non-governmental organization. We're working both in the United States and in Europe. We were the recipient of a Horizon 2020 grant. We're working across a number of different European states with a really wide stakeholder body. There are a number of key barriers. As we discussed, carbon emissions from the building stock represent approximately 40% of our overall emissions, and while we clearly need to decarbonize new construction going forward, we're stuck with the buildings we have. And so the need to come up with the ability to bring finance together with building owners and government organizations to develop business models and approaches that drive demand and encourage the type of investment necessary to really bring the trillions of dollars into this renovation effort to the existing building stock is very critical. The Investor Confidence Project is really focused on one critical barrier, which is confidence in the performance of these buildings and the performance of the renovations in terms of really bankable energy savings and cash flows that emerge for building owners, for various sorts of project investors, whether that be energy services companies or finance companies putting money into individual projects, and also to package these very complicated, unique projects into portfolios that we can bring to capital markets to access the literally trillions of dollars necessary for these sorts of renovations. And as we discussed, the good news is that energy efficiency really does pay for itself over the life cycle of these buildings and these projects, but there are many barriers that get in the way when you start talking about both individual transactions and also bringing capital markets to understand energy efficiency, which is fundamentally a decrease, not an increase. It's something that can't be measured, it can only be calculated. So the Investor Confidence Project has been working with really the financial community and building owners and businesses that are actually deploying technologies and developing these projects, as well as governments and other organizations trying to move the needle forward. And we're taking this very complicated world of retrofitting and renovation, which incorporates a wide range of technologies and approaches and standards, and turning it into a standard asset, a certified investor-ready energy efficiency project that has followed existing best practices, has consistent documentation, has been verified, and it's something that a building owner can look at and say, look, I have confidence that this is a real project, that I can believe these cash flows are real, and that can also be packaged into portfolios with real actuarial data on actual savings coming out of the marketplace that you can bring to the capital markets, to investors, to look at as a long-term fixed income type of an investment that will attract the kind of long-term capital required to see the, again, trillions of dollars necessary move into the marketplace. The critical problem that we've been having fundamentally, and what's kind of interesting, is that there's a tremendous amount of capital in the market right now looking for a home. I think that the banking community has started to at least identify that this is a growth opportunity and that this is a really large potential marketplace. And so what we're trying to do with the Investor Confidence Project is bring stakeholders together to agree on these common terms and, again, both in the near term, reduce transaction costs so that building owners and various investors looking at individual projects can have more confidence and actually deploy capital into each specific renovation. But also, in today's terms, build the kind of standardization into that process so that as we get larger and larger volumes, they can be turned into portfolios and something that capital market investors can actually understand and start to deploy capital into. So again, as a representative of civil society, our role with the Environmental Defense Fund and the Investor Confidence Project is really to act as a convener to bring these stakeholder groups together. I think the really good news is that there's a tremendous amount of interest on all parties. Building owners see the opportunity, they don't necessarily know how to access it. There's a huge amount of industry in this room, in this pavilion right now, that are deploying new technologies, new financial mechanisms, and a great need by both the utility sector and the governmental sector to see us start to achieve these goals. And based on that platform, we're finding that there's a great opportunity to really accelerate growth and a kind of a willingness by all parties to bring the capital, bring the buildings, bring the projects to the table. So we look forward to working with everybody in this room and talking more about how we remove these barriers and actually move the ball forward on hitting these 2-degree targets in the near term.
Thank you very much, Matt. I think you bring up a very important point and the missing link in a lot of the decarbonization projects across the board, not just in the building sector, which is how do we ensure that the capital actually flows to where it needs to go? How do we actually leverage private finance from public programs as well? How do we bring both together through PPPs, etc.? So I'll come back to you and also the IFC, if I may, as to how we can better do that, because as our distinguished chair indicated as we opened up the conference this morning, everybody says that this is the low-hanging fruit. Then why the hell aren't we there? Apologies for the H word, but I think it is a real problem. because we hear it at all levels, at the government level, at the business level. Everyone is prepared to work towards this goal, and yet it seems to be so complicated and so difficult to achieve. So I think we really still need to pin down exactly where the issues are and have some honest and difficult conversations about how we actually get there. Moving on to a very important participant in this panel, we've heard a lot about the impact and the growth of the building sector in China. We have with us Mr. Chen Zhen. Mr. Chen Zhen has a translator, so this process will go slightly more slowly, if that's okay. Just bear with us. And I don't know if you're ready, Mr. Chen Zhen, to give us a bit of your perspective, not only for your country and the region, but also how does someone working within the design realm ensure that we actually can move forward and make the right decisions and put in place the right enabling frameworks in order to be able to move forward and meet, for example, the China Accord principles and other principles that Architecture 2030 and others are trying to put in place. Thank you.
主持人好，女士们先生好。这个大家都知道，我们中国从16年到20年有一个5年计划，这是这个11月30号，我们国家主席习近平也代表中国政府对这个世界气候变化的减排做出了庄重的承诺。这个我们现在建筑师在研究一个问题：这个世界气候变化，建筑师的责任究竟在哪里？
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. As you probably have all heard, in China we have the 13th five-year plan coming up from 2016 to 2020. And our country President Xi Jinping has also committed to reducing carbon emissions as a response to climate change.
这个京都议定书之后，今天全球都在关注巴黎的气候峰会，因为大家越来越意识到，这个世界，这个地球对人类来讲就是唯一的一个地球。现在要零排，它一定是政府、企业、建筑师和各行各业以及每一个公民都必须要尽到责任和义务的一件事情，而绝不是建筑师一个方面能力有所为的。
So after Kyoto, all eyes are now on Paris. We only have this one planet, so we have to save it. We have to work together to address this problem. But solving climate change is not just the job of architects and designers. We need government, we need the private sector, we also need every single citizen to help in this fight together.
比方说刚才有一些发言，我们都在研究一个问题，这个绿色建筑和低碳减排，它是需要一定的技术和资金来支撑的。那么对资金的投入，这个究竟有没有回报？究竟要回报多少是比较恰当的？我们今天面临的这个非常严重的气候问题，我们能不能再提出另外一个思路？这个对绿色建筑和低碳的资金投入，能不能从贡献的角度来研究一个问题？再一个，作为建筑师，能不能通过我们的规划和设计，为投资方能够提供更多的回报？哎，这都是我们目前面临的一个挑战。
So a lot of the other guests have already mentioned that technologies and funding are absolutely needed in promoting greener buildings and low carbon buildings. So the question about how much are we getting back from investing in these green buildings and by when is a very key question. But I would like to come from the other side of the coin and see how, as architects and designers, what we can provide to our investors. How can we do designs in a way that give our investors returns? So it's another side of the coin. It's another angle. How do we work from planning and design to help increase the returns and financial benefits to our investors?
中国的建筑师也面临着巨大挑战。第一个，中国现在是世界上最大的发展中国家，尤其是这个从明年起的5年，我们要建成小康社会，要真正的解决7000万人的脱贫问题。那么这里面的建设量是巨大的。这个世界的咨询机构估计，我们后5年，每年大概占全球建设量的约40%。所以中国的建筑师面临一个巨大的这个节能、这个减排设计的压力。同时，中国呢这么巨大的市场，也面临了一个资金投资者对绿色建筑投入的回报的担忧。所以呢，我想呢，这一次的巴黎的峰会，通过今天我们的建筑日的研究，我个人感觉，我们建筑师现在最迫切的，可能是要赶紧行动起来，因为我们没有太多的时间再来继续研究利益问题和回报问题或者什么问题。现在行动是必须的，要加快的进行。
In terms of promoting green buildings in China, there are still a lot of challenges in China. Well, China is still the biggest developing country in the world. We also have set a target to reach the target of becoming a generally well-off society by 2020. That will be, in order to meet that target, we need to build a huge volume of buildings in China. And so we need to really reduce the energy consumption and emissions from this very, very large building stock. The second thing is finance is absolutely an issue. There are a lot of concerns about the returns from these investments in lower carbon buildings. But what's really important, the most important question here is not focusing on the financial returns from an architect's and planner's perspective, but to start working, because the climate change is not going to stop and wait for us to figure out how much money we're going to get back. We have to start working now and figure out as we go, as we build.
所以最近，中国的几十家著名的建筑企业和国外的一些建筑企业，我们在中国成立了一个全球低碳减排的中国倡议。我们开始加紧行动，通过培训、交流和项目的对接，我们想呢，从明年起就开始在我们中国的建筑设计行业加快推进低碳的规划和设计的步伐，配合中国政府，配合这次巴黎大会，把减排落实到我们中国建筑师的每一个设计作品中。
So in order to do that, as Mr. Edmasri has mentioned earlier, 52 of the international and Chinese architecture and design firms have come together and signed the China Accord. And from next year, we'll work together to accelerate this process of ramping up low carbon and zero carbon buildings design. And all of this is to support the Chinese government's work and to support the global effort here in Paris at COP, led by the UN to address climate change in the building sector.
Great. I'm going to have to stop you there if I may. I apologize.
所以最后，我想呢，我代表我们协会，欢迎今天在座的同行们有机会加强跟中国建筑师的合作，我们共同来应对气候变化的挑战。谢谢大家。
So the final word is just to welcome everybody to work together with the Chinese architects communities to in this fight together.
Thank you very much. First of all, may I congratulate the translator for doing an impeccable job. And secondly, congratulate you and your efforts, and also China on what it is doing. And I fully